Got a lot of things I would really like to get covered today, so we're going to try and move real quickly. We have been listing Baptist controversies. And again, I got to move quickly on these. We had mentioned the controversy, over Campbellism. We had mentioned the controversy over slavery, and not only what was your position on slavery, but whether or not you could fellowship, who you could fellowship with in respect to their position on the slavery issue. Similar thing comes up with the subject of the Masons. You put that down as the third one. Could a Baptist be a Mason? If you didn't think you should be a Mason, could you fellowship with Masons? Yes.
Bible colleges.
Okay, we got Bible college there. Bible colleges, number 3, doesn't matter what order we put them in. I got several things I'm trying to get in here. Whether or not to have Bible colleges, that was a significant battle. As you can tell, I'm opposed to them, so we'll just go on from there. Make it number 4, Masonry. Some folks considered the Masons a false religion. Some folks considered them just a social group. Why do you think there was such controversy over what the Masons were? Christian? Okay, let me say, you know why I think there's such controversy and it was difficult for people to get a unified reaction to the Masons? Masonry, without the slightest doubt, was originally a false religion. But for many people, it has become just a social group. And so you would find people reacting based a lot upon what Masons they knew, whether they happened to know Masons that took it seriously as a religion, or they knew Masons that just treated it as a club. But there was this debate, and there was a debate about whether or not you could fellowship with Baptists that took a different position on the Masons than you did. That debate is still with us, by the way. I don't think it's as strong as it once was. I think there's a fairly strong consensus that Masonry is a false religion, but that debate is still with us, and there have been a couple of prominent independent Baptist preachers of our century that were Masons and didn't see anything wrong with it. Okay? Yes, Christian.
Is it true that every president we've had is a Mason?
No. No, I've heard that too, but that's not true. The fifth one, I'm going to list several here to save time, but the fifth one has to do with whether or not you could use alcohol as a beverage. Now that may sound funny to us that there was a debate over that, but there really was. There was a significant debate among independent Baptists over that. And I think that debate has largely faded among Bible-believing Baptists, because we have seen so much of the influence of drunkenness and alcohol in our day. But believe it or not, 100 years ago, that was pretty heatedly debated. Okay? Another debate had to do with the second coming. And there's several aspects of that. There were Baptists who were post-millennial. They thought we could bring in a millennium. There were Baptists who were amillennial, didn't think there was going to be a millennium. There were Baptists who were premillennial. Now again, in our independent Baptist circles, this debate is virtually over. Almost every independent Baptist is premillennial. And so, but 100 years ago, that's not true. There was a real debate going on 100 years ago. And probably for a period of time, the postmillennialists were in the largest group. That's hard for us to understand today. But one of the things that happened, they saw the progress towards Christian culture and Christian civilization being made in the United States and England, and they just saw things getting better and better, and they said, this is going to lead all the way to the millennium. That was an easier position to take in the late 1800s than it is now, because we haven't watched things get better and better and better. What have we watched? Things get worse and worse and worse. And that has drawn people away from any temptation, I think, to believe in postmillennialism. You'll find a handful of people that do. I personally have never met a Baptist that was postmillennial. I have met not many postmillennialists, period, that were Bible believers. I think I have met a Reformed Presbyterian that was a postmillennialist, but I've never met a Baptist that was a postmillennialist. But that debate took place. There was another aspect of this debate on Bible prophecy. There was a fellow named William Miller, who, by the way, he's remembered today. His fame in church history is that he started Seventh-day Adventism. But he didn't intend to. He was actually an independent Baptist preacher. He preached the gospel. He was a soul winner. But he believed he'd interpreted the Bible to teach that Christ was coming back in 1843. So he spent a number of years guaranteeing everybody that Christ was coming back in 1843. And then, of course, he didn't come back in 1843. So he recalculated, decided it was 1844. And this got a great deal of attention all across the nation. I mean, groups of people gathered in certain spots to wait for the second coming. And he didn't come. And to his credit, William Miller admitted he'd been wrong about the whole thing and went back to being a normal independent Baptist preacher. But some of his followers came up with this crazy idea that Christ had returned spiritually but not physically, and they started their own movement, and they went off deeper and deeper and deeper into heresy and formed the Seventh-day Adventist movement. This gave the idea of preaching the imminent return of Christ a bad name, but it's not the doctrine of the imminent return of Christ. People still do this, by the way. It's harder for them to become well known. There was a guy who had a book out in 1988 about why Christ had to come back in 1988. And I mean, it got a lot of attention. He sent out free copies of it everywhere. I well remember I was pastoring at the time, and my church and another church went to a third church that had a gym for youth activity, and we had all our teenagers together for an all-night activity. It went over really well. This guy had Christ coming back in September of 1988. We had this activity. It went over really well. We thought it was a good one. The other visiting pastor and myself mentioned to the host youth pastor that, man, we'd like to get together and do this again, maybe, close, winter break or something like that. And he just looked at us like, so what do you mean? He said, none of us are going to be here then. We're dead serious. That Christ had to come back in 1988. Probably in September. And I mean, it's seriously big. He said, we have nothing on our church calendar after 1988, or after September. So, being the kind, compassionate person that I am, we waited till my friend and I got together on the last night of September. And kept trying to call him late at night, see how things were going. And for some strange reason, his phone was off the hook. We weren't able to get him. We kept calling until past midnight. And then we were into the first day of October, which you want to check and make sure he was there. We hadn't missed anything. But I'm sorry? No. Harold Camping made an issue of 1984. Yeah. And, why it was likely that Christ would come back. I think it was 84. He had his own date, but this was a different fella. I had a lot of people ask me about that, too, Camping and his date. And I think he had, I'm not sure exactly. I forget now what date it was, but he had a date, yes.
Camping was September of last year.
Oh, is that right? That was relatively... Yeah, maybe it was 94, something like that. Maybe more recent, I don't know. But I know, I think it does have to be more recent because I've had people ask me about it more recently. But he had a date, and he had a book, and somebody sent it to me, and I glanced through it. But all these folks come up with a calculation, and the calculation always starts with, if this is a picture of the rapture, then this is true, and this is true, and this is true, and this is true, and this is true. But the problem with that is, God never said whatever date they see, whatever event they seized upon was a picture of the rapture. And so they build everything on a false foundation. It doesn't matter how logical it is. If it's built on a false foundation, it doesn't matter. That's why in most of these books, the only thing that counts is the first chapter. Okay? And there'll be a hole in that. I mean, that's happened over and over. Oh, I know what I got confused about on them. When I say 84, it wasn't 84, 74. There was an independent Baptist preacher going around preaching that Christ had to come again in 1974 when I was in high school. And a young lady that I dated for 3 years during high school, she had surrendered to go to the mission field and was had plans to go to Bible college and get ready to serve the Lord and all that. And we went and heard this fellow preach, and it transformed her life. Her reaction to that was, I would only be a junior in Bible college in 1974, and if Christ is coming before I could finish the course and get to the mission field, why go and prepare? So she never went. Okay? You realize how long ago that's been? I mean, she could have been on the mission field for a long time. This kind of, and I'm not faulting her in the sense that, she went to a church and he was a fundamental Baptist fellow, and he's supposed to be, and he's preaching that. And but my point, this stuff is dangerous. It causes people to miss the truth. Really, William Miller is the most famous example, but there have been plenty of examples since. I knew folks that thought Christ had to come back in 1976. And I just have this sneaking suspicion that the God in heaven is not coming back anytime when folks said he was supposed to. And if he does, it's sure going to be a coincidence, not because they had it figured out. But be that as it may, this was a big battleground among independent Baptists. We had people who predicted, as these things come back to my mind now, we had people who predicted that the tribulation had to start in 81. I mean, there's always somebody, that has this. And this was a Baptist battleground. Bible's real clear. Scripture tells us that nobody knows when Christ is coming back. And there are things that can make us think about the tribulation because we see things happen that sound like what's going to happen during the tribulation. But anybody that goes to date setting, Bible says no man knows the day nor the hour, and so people keep responding to that by saying, I don't know the day nor the hour, but I know the month or the year or whatever, and they miss the whole point of that passage. Okay? And anybody who thinks they have figured out something that nobody before them ever knew needs to take a long look in the mirror and remember who they're dealing with. Okay? Anyway, this was a big battle. Here is the most important of the battles. Okay? For the next one. The fundamentalist modernist battle. The fundamentalist modernist battle. And I will have to tell you, this began in the Baptist colleges. You remember Spurgeon and the downgrade controversy? I remember from the last test, some of you at least knew it then. Not everybody, by the way, but some of you knew it then. When Spurgeon said modernists were starting to pop up among the Baptist Bible Union in England, and he was not going to tolerate any modernists in the movement, and they ended up throwing him out. Modernists start to show up in all of the Baptist conventions in North America. The American Baptist Convention, the Southern Baptist Convention, the National Baptist Convention, which is black churches, the Canadian Baptist Convention. Not a lot in these early days, but it starts to happen. Sooner or later, it's inevitable. Somebody gets by all of what you were planning, and somebody gets up in a college classroom and teaches something that is not just bad judgment, it's modernism. It's a denial of one of the basic fundamentals of the faith. Okay? And I don't care how good a school is or how hard they try, sooner or later somebody slips past them and that happens. That's inevitable. There is a right response to that. Throw the guy out immediately. Because you have to start, this is the real question that begins to be debated. How many modernists will we tolerate before we do something about it? Okay. Now, one of the things that sets the tone in the 1920s, this argument actually starts in the 1880s, because there's just a guy here and a guy there and so forth. There are not very many of them. But the argument really gets focused in the 1920s, because here's what's happened. One pastor in Princeton, Indiana, in the American Baptist Convention, who had, he's heard that they're modernists in the convention, but he doesn't really believe it. You know how sometimes things get started when they're not true and so forth. So he finally goes and checks for himself. And sure enough, he's got absolute proof at one American Baptist Convention school there's a modernist teaching Bible. So he said, this guy's got to go. We can't tolerate this. And it's obvious that the college isn't going to get rid of him. So then he says the convention's got to quit supporting his college. It becomes obvious the convention is not going to quit supporting the college. So then he says, our church is leaving the convention. And he puts it in front of the people, and the people, about 80% of the people vote to quit the convention in the church. The pastor's name was Ford Porter, and I'd like you to get that name down. This is not a well enough story as this story should be better known than it is. At that time it was called the Northern Baptist Convention. It's called the American Baptist Convention today. The minority in the church appealed to the convention, and the convention said, you can't leave. So this is a convention church. You can't pull it out of the convention. And Ford Porter said, yes, we can. We're Baptists. Baptists believe in an independent, indigenous church. And the convention said, no, you can't. So he claimed, the majority of the people claimed the building, and the convention claimed the building. This went to court, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. 2-year court battle. And the Supreme Court ruled that by definition a Baptist church was independent and owned its own facilities and was not owned by the convention. And that is the legal precedent that thousands of churches have used to leave the conventions ever since. One reason that I'm familiar with a story that's been largely forgotten, a number of years later, Ford Porter went to Indianapolis and pastored a church, and while he was there, he started a Bible college. It was never a large Bible college. It was called Indiana Baptist College. Never much more than 100 students or so. At least that's what it had while I was there. That's the school I went to. He was there and was active. I got to know him well. He was one of the 2 preachers that performed Cindy and I's wedding. Matter of fact, by the time I got to know him, he was well into his 70s, and his memory was slipping, but he had known Cindy all her life. Her parents had been in the church when she was born. And I was, Cindy's fiance, and then Cindy's husband. He had trouble with my name, but he always knew who I was. But he was also one of the 2 people that was involved in my ordination. And was a great man, loved the Lord and used to the Lord. But he answered the question, how many modernists will we tolerate this way? None. Said, if one modernist is acceptable, I don't belong. And I'm going to tell you, I have dear respect. We've got a good brother here that's Southern Baptist. I know a lot of good Southern Baptists. I have respect for people that stand for the truth and love the Bible themselves. But I will tell you, I believe that is the right answer to that question. How many modernists will we accept? And the answer is none. Trap. One of the things that's happened in the conventions that has been preventing churches from leaving, the conventions have started loaning money to churches that want to build buildings at 2 and 3% interest, with the stipulation in the loan that you'll never leave the convention. But that's a different matter, okay? What courts have been ruling is that you have to go back and pay the prevailing rate of interest if you then leave, that clause can't hold you in, but you can be made to go back and pay the prevailing rate of interest instead of the special favor that you got. Over and over again. I mean, there are still churches, back in the late 1980s, church that was close to me, and I ended up preaching for them a few times during this. Their members didn't know there was modernism in the American Baptist Convention. That may sound funny to us because the modernists got complete control of their schools. They'd heard it. They didn't believe it. They went out to American Baptist headquarters in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, asked the big wigs questions, and they wouldn't give them answers. They said, do we have any theology professors that don't believe in the inspiration of the Bible? They wouldn't answer them. Now, what's that tell you when they won't answer you? I mean, come to Landmark and ask, do we have any professors that don't believe in the inspiration of the Bible? We won't have to form a committee to study to give you an answer. Okay? So they left in 1986, had the same battle, 60 years later, from 27 to 86, 59 years later, had the same battle, went to the same legal precedent, and got the right to come out. Here's what the Supreme Court did that was right on target. They tried to get a definition of the word Baptist, and to define the word Baptist, they went to the historically recognized Baptist distinctives, which say the church is independent. And that was exactly the right call on the part of the Supreme Court. And that court case has been used over and over and over again as precedent for folks. Okay? Well, these weren't all the controversies. Let me refer to one more. We mentioned it yesterday, but I don't think I had you write it down. And I referred, you remember the story of the Primitive Baptists and how they got their name, and that we're also involved in a Supreme Court decision. Or I said yesterday, I mentioned it Tuesday. This was referred to as the means versus anti-means controversy. The means versus anti-means controversy. The folks who believed in means were basically the non-Calvinists. In this sense, some of them may actually have been Calvinists, but they believed it was right to witness. They believed it was right to give an invitation. They believed it was right to send missionaries. They believed it was right to use means to confront people with the gospel. Means versus anti-means. Again, those terms sound funny to us today. It's means versus anti-means. The anti-means people believe that witnessing is wrong, giving an invitation is wrong, that when God wants to save somebody, he'll just overcome them and save them. And again, that is the background I grew up in. This was so strong to them that they believed that giving money to a foreign missionary was sin, that going to somebody's door and witnessing to them was sin, that giving out a gospel tract was sin. Yes?
I wonder how many of you got started that were saved by the Lord overcoming this.
Well, you know what always fascinates me is even the folks that are anti-means got saved in means churches before they discovered the truth that you're not supposed to witness to anybody. In fact, this was something I brought up when we were debating this during my college years. You know, so why is it that God is choosing, since people are only getting saved because God overwhelms them, why is he only overwhelming people in churches that don't teach that? Yes.
One question they have trouble with is how can you get someone's blood on your hand if you're not responsible for witnessing?
Well, that's exactly right. But then there's a whole host of things they get in trouble with on this. But I want to tell you, you cannot imagine the depth of hold that this gets on people. And again, I had to deal with this because when I felt God dealing with me about being a preacher and I felt God preparing me, I mean, when I was in high school and I used to go on team visitation, I just tell my mom I was going to church activity. Because I knew if I said I was going on visitation, there'd be a brouhaha over it, you know, and I'd have to listen to the whole thing again about how bad I was and evil I was and all that kind of thing. And, I mean, honestly, other kids would sneak out to go drink. I would sneak out to go on visitation. I mean, it was that serious. I got belittled because I never had a drop of alcohol in my life. That made me a fanatic. But I had to hide going on visitation. I mean, that's how strong the mentality was. And if I'd come home drunk, I'd have got in trouble, but not near as much as I would have if I'd come home admit I'd been out on soul winning. Travis?
So Landmark will be considered a mean church?
I think that's a safe statement, Travis, that we would fit into that category. Then again, there was a whole package. You know, no evangelism, no missions, no Bible college, no paid preachers, no any of this stuff. And they also, I mean, they really go back to the root of all this debate. And I was born when my dad was 48, my mom was 42. They were older, and they go back to this whole generation. And as you can guess, they were part of the debate over alcohol and came down on the alcohol is okay side. So even though my mom was a Baptist, she would never have dreamed of being anything besides being a Baptist. It was a whole lot different than what kind of a Baptist I turned out to be. But let me tell you the really sad, I mean, there are a lot of sad parts to this, but my dad, when she married my dad, he was lost. In fact, my dad would have told you that he was an agnostic. He didn't know whether there was a God or not, and he didn't care. That was his catch line that he would repeat over and over and over again. And Mom didn't go to church, you know, Christmas, Easter maybe, if there wasn't too much going on. And if I understand it correctly, when I started riding the bus to church when I was 9, which I did in defiance of my mom, I had been to church previous to that twice in my life. Too young for me to remember. And lady came knocking on our door, working her bus route, and wanted to know if we had any children and could she pick them up for church. And before Mom could tell her no, I said yes. And Mom was too embarrassed to say anything, and then after she left, said, well, you're not going. I said, well, I told the lady I was going. And so I went anyway. And the pastor of that church, my dad was ill, and when we found out he was dying, I got him to church once. I got Mom to church on occasion. I got my dad to church once. When we found out he was more than just ill, but that he was dying, my pastor came out and led him to Christ. Thrilling thing. I can picture every detail of the room. My dad had an old red stuffed chair that he sat in, and there was a coffee, not a coffee table, but an end table and then a couch. My dad was in that red chair. The preacher was on the couch, and I was on the couch next to the preacher, listening to every word. But my mom's response to that, she was thrilled he got saved. She had never witnessed to him in all the years they were together. She was thrilled to find out he was one of the elect. You know, that God, and she gave no, credit to the preacher who was there witnessing to him at all, but it was some comfort to her, I guess, as he died and went out into eternity, that he was one of the elect. And if we'd been waiting for her to witness to him or say anything to him about trusting Christ, it would never have happened. So, I mean, I have a very keen sense of all this debate in my whole life, and have absolutely no sympathy for the pro-alcohol position, the anti-means position, the anti-missions position, the anti-paid preacher position, the anti-Bible position. But I started out debating these things. I had to debate all these issues before I ever got to Bible college. At my graduation party put on by my family, I was taunted because I wouldn't take a drink in celebration of my graduation. I had a relative who had an ability. He could pull the tab on a beer can, and some guys apparently know how to take a can like that. He could toss it to you and spin it in such a way that the liquid wouldn't come out. So he did that and tossed it to me, and I caught it. So I tossed it back to him, but I didn't know how to spin it right. And the beer went all over the living room. But so when we talk about Baptist controversies, this is not an idle time frame to me, because that was still so implanted on my family that this was a major factor in my youth. Well, I've got 20 minutes left, and I want to cover some important things yet. Let's talk for a minute about Baptists and the modern missionary movement. By the way, in my own defense, if at times I seem controversial or confrontational and even too confrontational, you understand, I grew up younger than you guys are having to fight for what I believed on these things on a daily basis. So I got started honest in it. We talk about the modern missions movement, and I don't have time to give you formal notes on this. Let me just make some points as we get down. We talk about the modern missions movement. We're talking about the period of time that starts in the 1700s when Baptist churches begin to band together to send out missionaries around the world. And one of the key things in starting this is a fellow named William Carey. He was a Baptist in England, and he was actually from the particular Baptist group, which was Calvinistic and did not have much of an emphasis on missions. Some of them were anti-means. But Carey became burdened about the fact that people in India, the Hindus, had never even heard of Jesus Christ. And he submitted his life to go to India. A fellow named Andrew Fuller, a pastor in England, decided to raise money from the churches to be able to send Carey to India. And believe it or not, they came under tremendous controversy of the idea of missions. And one preacher confronted Carey and said, "Young man, when God wants to save the heathen, he'll do it without your help." But they had a conference of churches, and they're debating over whether or not to authorize Carey's desire to go to India and to support him. Some of them were saying that's right, the Bible teaches us to spread the gospel, and others say no, we're insulting the sovereignty of God. Each church had been invited to send their pastor and 2 laymen to this conference. And one of the laymen was a general in the military. And they were debating this, about whether or not it would do any good to send missionaries and whether or not people were foreordained and predestined in a way that it does no good to present the gospel to them. And they're arguing this back and forth. And the general stands up in this debate and says, "I would not presume to try and teach all the pastors here theology. So there's a lot of things I don't know the answer to. But he said, I know one thing. So when the commander-in-chief says go, you go." Okay? And as far as I'm concerned, that settles that whole debate too. We'll worry about all the part that election played in it later. The commander-in-chief said go, and that ought to be enough. Anyway, Carey goes. Of course, the particular Baptists split and debate over all that and all that. He goes to India. I wish we had time to go into the story in great detail. It's a tremendous story. He goes to India. The person who goes with him has to return because of poor health. 2 other men show. They preach every week, trying to go witnessing and preaching and trying to win the Hindus to Christ. But a great deal of their time becomes consumed with putting the gospel in Bengali, which was the language in the region they're in. I mean, you're talking about people who never heard the name of Christ, never seen a Bible, never heard a Bible verse. And there's so much to this story. These men work in such dedicated fashion. They go 7 years without seeing a convert. And they go 13 years. Their first convert is an Englishman visiting an area. They go 13 years without seeing a Hindu saved. Can you imagine the temptation there would be to quit? They devote themselves to translating the Bible into Bengali. They get it translated. In those days, printing was much cruder than now. You would make each letter was a separate piece of type, and you would set it, and you would set a page, and you would have a metal tray of type. And to print a book almost took a warehouse, because you'd have this page here, and this page here, and this page here, and this page here. They have the Bible translated. They have all the type set. They're praying for the money for paper and binding and covers and so forth to put the Bible in the Bengali language. And the warehouse catches on fire. And they lose all their translation work and all the type. 13 years, no converts, all their work, almost no converts, all their work up in flames. Would that be grounds to quit? Next time y'all think about quitting Bible college and quitting the course, would that be grounds to quit? You just spent your last 13 years and it looks like you don't have anything to show for it? Well, I'll tell you, most incredible mission story I've ever heard. Baptists over England and the United States begin to hear about this, and they begin to flood Carey with money. I mean, they flooded him with money. They sent so much money that Carey actually wrote back and said, we don't want any more contributions for a while. We have more money than we know how to spend, and we're afraid it will ruin our testimony with the people here. And they hired a team of translators, and they hired a team to redo all that they had done with the type. And when they were done, they had the money to buy all the paper they wanted, and all the presses, and all the covers. And when they were done, they were putting out thousands of copies of the Bible in the Bengali language. But God had the whole thing under control all the time. They thought the fire was the problem. They said, Lord, send us money for paper. The fire was just part of God's plan. By the way, before too many years have passed, on one Sunday, Carey baptizes 2,000 converts. That's to take turns baptizing because they get worn out. Do you think while they'd gotten, let's say up to about the 1,000th baptism that day, they were sitting there saying, we should have quit back then. We should have just given up and gone on back home? Not only that, their story is used to inspire an incredible number of people to the mission field. Not just Baptists, but an incredible number of people to the mission field. Let me tell you one more story about this period of time, and again, there are many. A fellow named Adoniram Judson and his partner, Luther Rice, were going to missions we're going to go to India as Congregationalist missionaries. On their way, on the ship, they're studying the Bible, and they came to the conviction that the Baptists were right about immersion. So they decided they're going to preach believers' baptism. When their mission board finds out about it, they get angry with them and drop them. Judson decides to go on to the field. They won't let him in India, so he ends up in Burma. Luther Rice comes back to the United States to raise money for the project. Luther Rice becomes the spokesman that goes around the country preaching the idea of missions. Churches should support missionaries. We take that for granted. But I say Luther Rice is the one that provokes churches to have missions budgets all across the country. He never gets back to the field. He intended to, but he becomes the man that moves Baptist churches in the United States to support missions. Meanwhile, Judson and his again, it's an incredible story. He ends up getting arrested, being put in jail, and his wife has to come to him and take care of him in jail. The whole thing is an incredible story. They're so horribly mistreated and all. I don't have time right now to go into all the details, except to say as the missionaries begin to go to Burma. Yes, Christian? No, it was named after him. He didn't start it. Okay. Luther Rice Seminary is named after him. I want to tell you, out of this, a number of missionaries go to Burma. Here is one of my favorite mission stories. A missionary goes to Burma. When he gets there, he finds out he's not going to be allowed to preach in the village in the town that he was going to be in, planning to be in. And he's very frustrated. He's prepared to go here. The authorities say, we will not let you in this town. He's trying to figure out what to do. And Burma is basically inhabited by two groups of people, the coastal people who have all the cities and so forth and are the ruling people. There's a large tribe referred to as the Koreans. And this missionary is trying to figure out, why does God have me here? And a Korean native comes into town asking people. They've heard that God has sent mankind a book, and they want God's book. Where do you find God's book? And so somebody sent him to this missionary. And he comes to this missionary who said, what am I doing here? I can't even go to the place I was prepared for. And this native tells him, our whole village is praying that God will send us his book so we can know what God wants us to know. He goes back and preaches to them. And within a few weeks, baptizes over 3,000 people. In less than a year, they not only have a church, they have missionaries going throughout the carrying people all over Burma. It is an incredible story. From 1890 to 1936, they baptized over 2,000 people a year. And in our day and age, there are people who've said that the Korean tribe is the most Christian group of people in the world. We don't hear much about them. Matter of fact, right now, the ruling government in Burma has been practicing genocide against the Koreans. Eventually, the Christian and Missionary Alliance came in, but all over these villages out in the jungle, you could go to village after village, and you'd find a Baptist church or a Christian Missionary Alliance church, which at least preached the gospel. And today, those folks suffer incredible persecution, and our government won't lift a finger. Our news media won't cover it. Our politicians, for the most part, won't talk about it. There have been a couple tried to make an issue out of it in Congress and have called upon Congress to cut off American aid to Burma until this stops. But it is an absolutely incredible thing that happens among these people. My heart was stirred when, in the aftermath of World War II, when we occupied Japan, and Douglas MacArthur opened it up to missionaries, and Douglas MacArthur was very frustrated because he could not get American missionaries, very many of them, to come to Japan. The Korean people in Burma sent dozens of Bible-believing Baptist missionaries to the Japanese. I think sometimes we get caught up in the idea that just about everything God's doing, he's doing here, and that's not the truth by any stretch of the imagination. But it was incredible what God did among these people, and I say this also to make this point. He said, what about the heathen that have never heard? The Bible says they're without excuse. But I believe this. I believe when a lost man in a heathen world, because many, many stories of missionaries, they spend years preparing to go somewhere, and they get somewhere, and then find out there's somebody asking the Creator God what he's supposed to know. I believe that if a lost person in a heathen culture does say, look, God, I know you created this world, that's just self-evident. I want to know what you want me to know. God put somebody there to tell them. And when a whole village said to the Creator God, what do you want from us? The Creator God had been preparing somebody for years for that moment, because nothing catches him by surprise. I mean, he knew exactly what was going to be prayed when, and he had an answer ready for it. God has not failed in any sense to have everything under control. Well, there's, again, a lot more that could be said about that, but I've got to say a little bit more about the fundamentalist modernist controversy. 1920s, as we mentioned, Ford Porter in the court case, that becomes very important. When you get into the 1930s, this thing really heats up. 1940s, 1950s, and so forth, that's very much the case. Groups begin to leave the convention and form new groups. Groups leave the convention over modernism. Out of this, all kinds of groups are formed. The Conservative Baptists is a group that left the American Baptist Convention. The General Association of Regular Baptists is a group that left the American Baptist Convention. Robert Ketchum, what a marvelous man. He preached and fought against modernism and went across the country and spent his life exposing modernism. One of my favorite stories, he would get up in the pulpit, and he'd quote from these modernist Baptists to prove how bad they'd gotten. He was in a church one day, and the deacon came late to the service, and he missed the introduction, and he didn't know who Ketchum was, and he didn't know why Ketchum was there, and he got there while Ketchum was quoting, and he didn't hear any of the preface to it. But he walked in as Ketchum is quoting the modernists, and that deacon walked up to the pulpit and said, "You can't preach that here." Well, his sense of timing may have been wrong, but at least his stand was right. Ketchum devoted his life to fighting modernism, and God used him to cause many, many churches to come out. The modernist battle began in the Southern Baptist Convention. It began later than in the American Baptists. My own opinion, the reason the Southern Baptist Convention grew to be so big and so strong and had a stronger doctrinal base than the other conventions had to do with a fellow named B.H. Carroll. He wrote a book-by-book series that covered the Bible, and for a number of years, when you went to a Southern Baptist college, that's what you did. You went through his volume on Genesis, and then you went through his volume on Exodus, and then you went through his volume on Leviticus, and then you went through the whole Bible that way, and that's what you did for 4 years. At the end, you had a degree. They said you're ready to be a preacher. Yeah. Southern Baptist Convention left that, and I don't think they ever recovered from it. B.H. Carroll was a good man. Not that he had everything right, and he tells all his commentaries are full of illustrations from the Civil War, which don't necessarily relate to folks very well today, but he was sound Bible man. And because of that, there were a lot of sound preachers in the convention. When they departed from that, they went a direction that I personally believe many independent fundamental Baptists are going today. I got 5 minutes left in this course, so now I'll say the thing that would get me into most trouble. Okay? They begin to want recognition and accreditation by government for their schools. And in order to get it, they always would say, we're not going to change anything, we're not going to compromise anything, we just want this recognition, this accreditation. Let me tell you something. The world is not going to accredit. The world has never accredited what Bible-believing Baptists were doing. And even when they said they weren't going to compromise anything, they had to. There'd be a little compromise here, and a little compromise here, and a little compromise here. And I don't have time to tell you how it happened in the convention, so let me tell you how it's happening today. Independent Baptist colleges go for accreditation, because with accreditation you get respect, and with accreditation you get money. Okay? You don't know how many young people have called this college, especially since we've been visible over the last few months. So they're looking for the college, but they want an accredited college because they want the government to pay for their education. And they only do that for accredited colleges. People say, well, we took government accreditation. We're independent Baptists. We didn't have to change a thing. Really? Check their schools. Curious thing, these accredited schools that didn't have to change anything, they don't have missions departments anymore. You know why? Because the world doesn't consider missions academically credible. They're full of teachers who did not come from fundamental Bible-believing schools, because the world says you've got to have this many doctorates from accredited schools and this many master's degrees from accredited schools. I don't think we have a single person on our faculty that would be entitled to teach in an accredited school. I mean, if Dr. Carter retired from the pastorate and wanted to go train preachers somewhere, the accredited schools could not hire him. He would not be qualified to train young preachers. They can tell you all they want to. It doesn't affect anything. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't make any difference. But it's not the truth. And the Southern Baptist Convention reached a point where it became almost overwhelmed by this. All the Southern Baptist schools went into accreditation. And it changed the Southern Baptist Convention, and it opened up the doors for the modernists in their colleges. I will tell you, we are living just in the last 10 years, most of our independent Baptist colleges have gone for accreditation. And they haven't been in it long enough to see everything that's going to happen, but they've just been in it long enough to start seeing to start getting some hints, like when two of the schools that have been most famous for turning out missionaries the last 50 years have just closed their missions department. We talked for a little while, this isn't going to happen, but we talked a little while with some people in Michigan who had an aviation training school in connection with an independent Baptist college in Michigan. And for 20 years they've been training missionary pilots. And the school they had connection with just went for accreditation. And the accrediting committee said, wait a minute, those guys you got teaching pilots don't have master's degrees from accredited schools. All they know how to do is fly airplanes. And they said, you can't have them on the faculty. So they decided they're no longer going to train missionary pilots. And there was some talk of them picking up their whole operation and moving here to Florida. It's not going to happen, but we did talk with them for a while. And the pastor that put me in touch with them said, I can't understand why they do that, the college. And I said, I can understand. It was college he graduated from. I said, I can understand why they do that. The state told them to. You don't start asking the state for instructions on how to train people for the Lord's work, because they are not going to quit with giving you one or two. And I will tell you right now, this is overwhelming our independent Baptist movement. And if we don't wake up and learn from this, 25 years from now, our independent Baptist movement will have as much problem with modernism as any of the conventions do. And there are only a handful of schools that have resisted that pressure. And I will tell you, because you're going to one of them, probably you're going to hear over and over again, you ought to go here, you get money, you ought to go here, you get respect, you ought to go here, your credits would transfer to a secular college. Let me tell you something, credits that are transferable to a secular college aren't worth having, not if you set aside to do the Lord's work.
Right.
Even in our independent Baptist circles, the majority of people have lost sight of this truth. And I tell you, I'm not trying to fuss or fight with any of the brethren. I have taken this position for 10 years, and I'm going to continue to take it. I will not recommend any school or recommend anybody to any school anywhere or put any stamp of approval on any school that's got the stamp of approval of the world on it at the same time. Okay? I believe that is going to be the most important battle we're going to fight over the next 10 years. And I'm glad to be part of a school that's on the right side of that battle. And I'm glad you all have chosen to come to schools on the right side of that battle. Lord bless you all.